Hi everyone, just felt I'd make this little impromptu stream. You might be wondering why I'm dressed like a Hasidic Jew, and that's because we've just had Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, and I thought we might talk about that. I thought we might talk about the Feast of Trumpets and how that pertains to eschatology. Now, of course, no, I'm not dressed like a Hasidic Jew, I'm dressed like a pirate. You know, interestingly, if you fly the Jolly Roger in the United Kingdom, you'll be fined. It's illegal to fly the Jolly Roger in the United Kingdom. It's actually illegal to fly any flag in the United Kingdom that isn't your country's flag on private on your private property. Even I think if you're a business, you can get away with flying different flags, and schools fly flags and things like this. But if you were to put the Jolly Roger up for your kids' children's party, you would be fined. I think that's incredible. You know, I think it's diabolical. I come back to a quote that I heard the other day there that I really love from Anne Rice in her book, The Vampire Lestat, famously authored Interview with a Vampire. Very few beings really seek knowledge in this world. Few really ask. On the contrary, they try to wring from the unknown the answers they already shaped in their minds. Justifications, confirmations, forms of consolation without which they cannot go on. To really ask is to open the door to a whirlwind. The answer may annihilate the question and the questioner. And so in the video, I'm testing this gold coin, right? It's not just because I've gone crazy. I just thought that was a nice thing to do. You want to test the quality of something, don't you, to see if it's the authentic article. Now, I was listening to Derek's latest video, you know, Christianity ended AD 70s, his message, you know, and he says he's going to leave that and not talk about that so much now. And I get that, I really do, because ultimately, you know, for the vast majority of your effort, those you're interacting with, when you have a message such as Christianity ended or something like that, well, you're speaking to Christians who are already so enmeshed in their little paradigm that it's really hard to go to someone cold and convince them of your information. They already have to be seeking to come into that truth, is what the situation is. And it's, you know, it's a funny thing because there is that frustration. And when I find people who are not Christians but who are otherwise spiritual, well, I'm quite excited sometimes to share this information, and they just look at me glossy-eyed like, yeah, I suppose. And you realize then that in order for them to get the oomph, I would have to indoctrinate them into Christianity and then take them out of it and be like, oh yeah, you see what I'm talking about? But they don't need that. They don't need to be indoctrinated into Christianity. They've already got a living, vivacious relationship with a God who they know. A living God, eh? What an idea. And a God who keeps his promises. So this is going to be a wee comprehensive, a wee tour de force. Not a wee tour. This is going to be a good tour. You ever heard of a hot tamale? If you're in Australia, if you're in America, you've probably heard of hot tamales. They're a chewy, cinnamon-flavored, oblong-shaped candy introduced in the 1950s. I've never had a hot tamale. I don't know what it would do to my stomach, but it sounds like something I would eat as a kid. It just sounds like a fun little meal. You know, again, looking back at before I get into Isaiah, yeah. Now, do we know exactly how Isaiah was killed? Isaiah was a prophet 800 years before Christ came onto the scene. That's he's about 400 years before Daniel comes onto the scene. And I find it quite interesting, isn't it, that even as far back as Isaiah, indeed further back than that, we have these eschatological tenets coming into clear view. Of course, in Isaiah, it's there, the information's there. It's not as rigorously spelled out as we see in Daniel, but Daniel does indeed take those same tenets, polish them up real nice, and deliver them to the people. And then, of course, the prophets in the first century made a very good job of emphatically instilling in their congregations the belief that the end was nigh. And of course, we're forgotten about this today. And so you look at the history of the church, you know, and of course, Isaiah the prophet I think it's believed that he was actually martyred and killed, wasn't he? And if you look to the Catholic Church too, there's a history of heresy here, and it would seem like the burnings at the stake and things like that, they really amped up round about the 11th and 12th centuries, and that's where we saw it really kick off really nastily. Not that there wasn't nastiness before then. I wasn't aware until Derek brought it up about the horrors that Constantine the Great worked in his life. Of course, Constantine the Great mainstreamed Christianity of the kind of what evolved into the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And you look at him, a man who murdered his wife and murdered his son, and you think, oh, of course this isn't inspired. Man murdered his wife and son. That's not very good at all. I would expect a lot more in this age than that kind of conduct. And then, of course, all these killings. Jan Hus, he kind of instigated the starts of the Protestant movement. He had a word or two against these priests who would charge for these rituals, for baptisms, for sacraments. Freely you have received, freely give. And it's not a bad thing to take some income from your ministry. Of course it isn't. But to go after the poor and to take from those who have very little, he called that out. And he said, look, if I could do this for free, it would be my joy to do so. And I'm sure he had other theological matters that he wasn't quite comfortable with the Catholic Church espoused, but still, to burn the man at the stake, the humanity. And then, of course, William Tyndale, a few decades later, for trying to translate his Bible into English, he got burned at the stake. They say that they knocked him unconscious. Well, one of the kind executioners knocked him unconscious before burning him alive. And then you just see a history of a litany of just abuses and confusions, burning witches, torturing in perverse ways people who disagree with you, the factions, the warfare. And you think, what is the spirit of this movement? Certainly, you would expect some kind of condemnation from God. God dealt with his people in Israel whenever they stepped out of line and did such behaviors. And it was pointed out by Derek, the Pharisees were not as bad as Constantine the Great. The Pharisees were not as bad as the Catholic Church. If you want to measure against measure the egregious evil that each party has done, I think it's an equal filling, if not more, because at least they didn't have the full disclosure before Christ, did they? But now we're supposed to live in the age of enlightenment, the illumination of the Holy Spirit. We're doubling down on the murder and mayhem. Something's wrong here. Something's desperately wrong. And Isaiah's going to tell us what. That's a nice beverage. That's Perthshire Scottish mountain water with a little bit of summer fruits squash in there. Thousands were burned at the stake for heresy in the 11th and 12th centuries. But what were their crimes? And how did these individuals, often known as Cathars, fall victim to this terrible punishment? This article was published in 2014. Professor Bob Moore, a scholar of religious... This is a little tidbit I just want to add in. So Bob Moore, a scholar of medieval religious heresy, is to explore the Cathars at a lecture in the University of Nottingham. In an interview with History Extra, he revealed everything you need to know about heresy. So, what was medieval heresy? Heresy was an opinion about the teaching of the Catholic Church, which was condemned by the Church as inconsistent with it. From the 11th century, many people accused of heresy were burned at the stake as a result. Now, I'm just saying words right now. That's just words out of my mouth. Burned at the stake. Now, try and put yourself there. Put yourself on the stake. Put yourself in the place of the executioner. Put yourself in the audience. We're all one. It basically happened to us all, each role. Disastrous, horrible, you know. There's a wee thought played in my head there. It's a really tangential thought. God has this amazing capacity to love. And if every human being in the world, 8 billion strong, were to muster as much love as they possibly could, they wouldn't even come to a drop in the water, the love that God has for us. And it's such a shame we deal with each other so disgracefully. Who were the heretics? It's impossible to group them over such a huge period of time, but until around 1160, only a small number were put to the stake, but they would have been alleged to be leaders of heretic groups. From then onwards, you start to see ordinary people being put to death too. So it's like a pandemic, isn't it? You get a taste for evil. What was it Christ told us? A little leaven leavens the whole loaf. And gosh, I don't know. These things are true to say, but you shouldn't lose your cool over them. That doesn't mean like you're aware of that then you should start scrambling to stop the leaven getting in. It's like, listen, it's going to be fine, man. God's writing the story. You know what I mean? We'll try our best to be the best agents for good that we can. We don't need to worry about holding the fort for God. God is the fort, and it's through the fort. How many people were burned for being heretics? Again, impossible to say, but we do know that on many occasions, heretics were burned in large groups, 200 at a time. That gives you an idea of the scale. Can you imagine, in your pious arrogance, right? It just takes me back to that Aldous Huxley quote that Brother David posted a few weeks back. It's this psychological luxury of a righteous indignation that you might work some malevolent act, but for a good cause, right? And it really lets those who are in darkness stretch their legs. It really lets them manifest, as they like to say, and it lets them manifest. 200 souls could be, I mean, that's just words. That's just air going into your ears and turning into electrical signals and all the rest of it getting processed in the brain. But that was a reality. That was 200 people. Real people. It happened in the past. Einstein wouldn't speak of the past. He just speaks of the ever-present. Time is just an illusion, something we use to categorize things. I forget the exact quote there, but I can find it right now because it was in one of my memories. Oh God, is it tomorrow already? No, it's tomorrow already. All right, I'll not get that quote. What did heretics believe? Every group believed different things. There is a widely held assumption that heretics who were burned in southern France were part of a Europe-wide heretic movement who believed there were two gods, one good and one evil. But this is not my view. I will be expanding on this in my lecture. Most heretics, the ones we can identify that is, tended to believe in a very simple form of Christianity based on literal readings of the New Testament. They placed high value on chastity and were opposed to any ostentatious wealth and to the wealth and power structure of the church. That's where you come into conflict with the church. I believe it is so. As soon as you challenge the power of the church, and what is the power of the church? Is it God? I mean, this is talking about, the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. No, the power of the church isn't God. It's money and political power. That's what we're talking about. Talking about political capital. How were heretics treated? This changed over time. And remember, Isaiah, who we're going to talk about, is among the number of charged heretics, right? He was killed. He was martyred. This changed over time. The usual assumption in the Middle Ages was the age of faith, when people hated heretics, but I don't know this is true. There is no indication that they did not get on and coexist with Catholics until outsiders such as Crusaders and Inquisitors came in. For example, the 20-year Albigensian Crusade, Albigensian Crusade, which began in 1209, was accompanied and followed up by persecution. Who were the Cathars? If you visit the south of France today, you'll see there's huge tourist activity that rotates around the word Cathars, a Christian sect that believe the devil made the world and everything in it. You know, there's going to be a lot more to say on that. I recommend you go to David McMurdo if you want to learn about the Cathars. And that was the sacrament of the church. And that the sacraments of the church were not true sacraments of Christ, but devilish frauds of a church of the wicked. But people who were called heretics were not called Cathars in the Middle Ages. There's a disagreement between historians about whether it's right to call these people Cathars. What does that matter? Because if you simply call all heretics Cathars, then you are implying that they are part of a European-wide movement, an anti-church group pitted against the Roman Church. I argue this idea. Okay, so in any case, it's pretty bad. Where and when did religious heresy originate? This will be the last wee point before I get into the scripture. From the early 11th century, but slowly at first, then more and more people were accused of holding heretical beliefs. Of course, you know, we did have heresies in the 1st century, but they got a bit stabby towards the end here. There are two, this is within the Christian movement. There are two major reasons for that. Firstly, it may have been the case that people accused were in conflict with the ecclesiastical authority, that is, priests who were causing problems for their bishops by being outspoken about the shortcomings of the church. In this case, being accused of heresy was about ecclesiastical discipline. Secondly, lay people who were accused may have been so normal people who were accused may have been in conflict with the church over property or revenues. From the late 11th century, the Roman Church went through a process of reformation based in the first place on the demands it demands that its appointments should be made without the intervention of secular authority, and that its priests should be celibate. The first meant that considerable wealth, that is land, was at the disposal of the church. That was acceptable to the lay nobility on the basis of clerical celibacy, so that churchmen could not use church land to found rival dynasties. That's very interesting, isn't it? That there might be that connection there, you know. They didn't want the land to go to the church if they were going to found dynasties, so they had to be celibate. However, there were those purists who didn't want to compromise, and so they had to be weeded out. For example, priests who refused to compromise were condemned. This was the main source of accusations of heresy in the 12th century. But it's important to note that heresy wasn't just about the church. In fact, the people who moved fastest against accused heretics were lay rulers, not churchmen. And it's not just about religion. From the 12th century onwards, persecution became more extreme against lepers, sodomites, prostitutes, and Jews. And that sort of thing has been going on ever since. Yeah, man, people love to murder. They just can't get enough of that. All right, let's get into these scriptures. Hey, Sonic, thank you. Good to see you. Yeah, brutal times. It's so important to remember the past so it can be so we don't want to repeat the past. We need to remember it, take stock, reflect, and move forward, not repeating those same mistakes. Man, got a lot of seashells here. I've been in Largs, a little coastal town recently. That's a nice one. All right, what's Isaiah got to say to us then? What is Isaiah going to say? He's not speaking to us the way he was speaking to Jews 800 years before Christ. And of course, he met his end too. In the hands of murderers. Starting from Isaiah 24. Behold, the Lord makes the earth empty and makes it waste, distorts its surface and scatters abroad its inhabitants. Remembering that when we're speaking about the earth, we're talking about Israel. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master. As with the maid, so with her mistress. As with the buyer, so with the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower, creditor, debtor. The land shall be entirely emptied and utterly plundered. For the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and fades away. The world languishes and fades away. So all of a sudden we're thinking of all those scriptures in the New Testament, aren't we, about the old things passing away and becoming obsolete. Hebrews verse 9, looking for that time of Reformation, the old system passing away. Romans chapter 8. Do I remember the content of Romans chapter 8? No. But does that sound kind of relevant right now? Of course it does. It's inspired in Romans chapter 8. Right? This is what we're talking about. The old things are passing away. The haughty people of the earth languish. The earth is also defiled under its inhabitants. Because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinances, broken the everlasting covenant, therefore the curse has devoured the earth, and those who dwell in it are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. A righteous remnant, eh? The new wine fails, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. The mirth of the tambourine ceases. The noise of the jubilant ends. The joy of the harp ceases. They shall not drink wine with a song. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. The city of confusion is broken down. Every house is shut up so that none may go in. There is a cry for wine in the streets. All joy is darkened. The mirth of the land is gone. In the city, desolation is left, and the gate is stricken with the destruction. When it shall be thus in the midst of the land among the people, it shall be like the shaking of an olive tree, like the gleaning of grapes when the vintage is done. They shall lift up their voice, they shall sing for the majesty of the Lord, they shall cry aloud from the sea. Therefore glorify the Lord in the dawning light. The name of the Lord God of Israel in the coastlands of the sea. From the ends of the earth we have heard songs. Glory to the righteous. But I said, I am ruined, ruined. Woe to me. The treacherous dealers have dealt treacherously. Indeed, the treacherous dealers have dealt very treacherously. Fear and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. And it shall be that he who flees from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he who comes up from the midst of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth are shaken. The earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth is shaken exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall totter like a hut. Its transgression shall be heavy upon it, and it will fall and not rise again. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will punish on high the host of exalted ones, and on the earth the kings of the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and will be shut up in the prison, and many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be disgraced, and the sun ashamed. For the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders gloriously. Now, this is 400 years before Daniel comes on the scene. And everything we've talked about on this channel, you feel it, you hear it, it's in there. I can hear that eschatological narrative, that music of the end in there. The pace, the rhythm, the tone. Now, speaking of the moon being disgraced and the sun ashamed, I came prepared today. See, this kind of language which we see in Matthew 24, in the context of the fall of Jerusalem, we also see this referring to the fall of Babylon, Egypt, Edom, and Israel in Isaiah 13, 9-10, Ezekiel 32, 7-8, Isaiah 34, 45, Amos 5, 21-22. The sun, the moon, and the stars represent the universe of Israel. Jewish writers understood that the light referred to the law, the moon, the Sanhedrin, and the stars, the rabbis. I tried to recount that from memory in a previous video, and going with that, I think I got it right. So we continue as we go into this, because Isaiah says it all, man. It wouldn't be the third temple, it'd be the fourth. Solomon's temple, Herod's temple, fourth temple's being built with Yeshua being the chief cornerstone. Architectural metaphor. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you want to number them, mate. It honestly doesn't matter. The temple we're talking about is the one that was there when Jesus was alive, because that's the one his disciples asked him about, is it not? Yes, it is. So it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? It honestly doesn't matter what numbers you use and how you count it up and the mathematical equations. We're told explicitly in Matthew 24, tell us about the falling down of this temple and of the time of the end. Because as Isaiah's going to show us in these chapters, when that temple fell, it would never be rebuilt again. He's just said that. It will never be again. And it will fall and not rise again. So if there's any way at the end of this video I can connect those kinds of statements to Matthew 24, there isn't really any wiggle room left. And I'd like to remind you, if you look at Daniel chapters 9 and 12, if I just read through Daniel's chapter 7 through to 12, the final eschatological tenant, the last thing to happen in Jewish eschatology is the temple falling down. That's why in Matthew 24 they asked about it. That is a huge deal that's consistently overlooked through necessity to facilitate futurist beliefs. You just have to disengage from that. And you know, it's funny, I was speaking to my girlfriend. Let's make it Facebook a fish. And I says to her about being an atheist and all the rest of it. And I say, see, if I met you 10 years ago, what would the conversation be like, you know? Obviously, I wouldn't know this, and she would be a raging atheist or something like that. And I always sympathise and say, being an atheist isn't that weird. I know what it's all about. But she put it in terms for me that I found quite helpful. She said, it's almost like I wouldn't be able to hear you. She said it would be like white noise to me. I knew what I was like back then. If you came up to me saying something that was probably quite profound and insightful, I wouldn't have heard it. I would have just thought you were a bit odd. Nothing would have struck me. Nothing would have occurred to me. I wouldn't have had the capacity to hear you. And I think Jesus said it, those who have ears, those who have eyes. Because we're very selective in the kind of data points that we want to put into the computer. If you don't put the correct coding into your operating system, it's going to crash. You're not going to get the results. You know what I mean? And who's it for? Who's that for? What you try to do. You know what I mean? That's my wee game. So I'm just going to stick right back into this. I will engage with writings, but Isaiah 25 is calling. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things. Your counsel of old are faithfulness and truth. For you have made a city a ruin, a fortified city a ruin, a place of foreigners, to be a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, the strong people will glorify you. The city of the terrible nations will fear you, for you have been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in distress, a refuge from the storm, a shade from the heat, from the blast of the terrible ones, is as a storm against the wall. You will reduce the noise of aliens as heat in a dry place, as heat in the shadow of a cloud. The song of the terrible ones will be diminished. And in this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of choice pieces, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of well-refined wines on the lees. This is us talking about the marriage feast. And he will destroy on this mountain the surface of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. So this is the gospel going out to the whole world. The kingdoms of the world become the kingdom of God. He will swallow up death forever. But obviously talking about the end here. That's when death will be swallowed up forever. Remember in John 5, Jesus Christ said to a first century audience, the hour is coming and now is when those who rest in the dust of the earth shall rise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. Those are the exact same words spoken to Daniel the prophet in Daniel 12, chapter 2. He was told that he would rest in the dust of the earth until that time. But you go on your way, Daniel, you shall rest, and on the last day you will rise. When did Jesus Christ come into the world? Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2. In these last days, God has spoken to us from his Son. Is it 1 Corinthians 10:11 or 1 Corinthians 11:10? 1 Corinthians 10:11 strikes me as a particularly important verse. It's funny how you can remember the verse, but you don't remember the entire content. Now, these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Yeah, you're just not paying, you just don't want to hear it. I mean, I'm not adding any spice to that. I didn't make up that verse. I'm not really struggling and striving to make it fit something I believe. I'm being forced to accept a plain reading that's evidently true based on even what I've just read, where we're told where this city falls, it's not getting built again. It will never be rebuilt. Isaiah 25, verse 2. And we know we're talking about the last days because you read a little further and we're talking about such a time as where the dead rise. And isn't it very convenient that that's what Jesus says in Matthew 24? Isn't that strangely convenient? That Jesus says the temple will fall, the dead will rise. These are the signs of the end. The Feast of Trumpets, eh? So there we are. I'll pick it up on chapter 25, verse. I keep mixing up the words. Chapter 25, verse 9 now. And it will be said in that day, behold. No, let's start from 7. And he will destroy on this mountain the surface covering cast over all people. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. Of course, we read this language in the book of Revelation, don't we, about the wiping away of the tear. God will wipe away the tear. In the book of Revelation, also known as the book of things which must shortly come to pass. We read that in the first chapter, and in fact, in the very first line, first chapter, and in the last chapter, it insists that this is the book of things that must shortly come to pass. That exact terminology. And then also in chapter 1, verse 3, we're told it is the time at hand. And of course, the whole thrust of that book is there's no time to repent anymore. This is the time. It actually says that. I mean, that's a weird message for Christianity, but that's what the book says. Let those who are holy be holy. Let those who are unrighteous remain unrighteous, for the time is at hand. That's a very strange Christian sentiment to maintain, because no one's believing that, are they? No one's doing that. And yet the book insists that's the time now. It says this is the time that we're in. John, to whom this letter has been conveyed, this is my message to you. There's no time for the righteous to change. There's no time for the just to dilly-dally. And that's exactly what Peter emphasized, wasn't it? Where he said, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be sober and watchful in your prayers. Couldn't he make it up? I'm forced to speak the truth on this matter. That my conscience would chew me up and spit me out if I tried to reject this. I don't want to be an advocate for a particular position that tickles my fancy with this. This is not what I'm doing. I mean, there's wee things that tickle my fancy. I'd quite like to believe in aliens, but I can't argue about that for the scriptures. Scriptures did mention the word aliens in there, but that wasn't talking about ET, was it? It was talking about foreign people. I can't get a belief in aliens out of the scriptures, can I? As much as I think that's a curious wee idea, I can't get to it. The script, it's not there. It's not there, so I can't do it. But this preterism, I am basically being commanded by I don't know. I don't want to big it up. Just by a faith, by a desire to know the truth. I'm being commanded to utter these words and express it in this way. And as I've said, when we look at how Christianity has displayed its soul over the last few centuries, disgusting, depraved beyond measure. Indeed, the most grievous of sins, the unforgivable sin, if you will, which is really the third commandment, taking the Lord's name in vain. These people supposed they were priests, mediators between men and God. And because people said the wrong words, they killed them. They killed them. And that's thousands of years, near enough, of church history. Over 1,000 years of church history. That's scary. That's disappointing, deeply disappointing. That would make an angelic host weep. It's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. Just about finished here with this chapter 25. Oh my goodness. So that veil comes off, he wipes away the tears. And it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. We will be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Absolutely. As Paul said, our salvation draws closer than we first believed. That was for them. That was written to them. You know what I'm saying when I'm talking about these people that were these heretics, 200 burnt at a time? And that just sounds like little words that come in. Oh, that was a reality. That was screaming people. They're burning flesh, loved ones dying round about them. That happened. Similarly, when Paul wrote